Welcome. New chapter, aggregate demand. This is going to be a bit of a beast. My apologies in advance. It's a lot of listening, but oh well, let's just get through it. Aggregate demand is not too far off of the demand that you know. In microeconomics, obviously, we talked about supply and demand. In this chapter, obviously, it's a macroeconomics chapter. So you're going to analyze the concept of aggregate demand. So by definition, what aggregate demand is the total spending on goods and services in a period of time at a given price level. Because remember, price determines demand. That's the law of demand, isn't it? So when we look at the diagram below, right, you can see that this is a supply and demand curve, a microeconomic one that we're familiar with, and guess what? The macroeconomic aggregate demand curve looks pretty similar. Instead of price being a price for a single good, it's the average price level across an industry, while you have Y being the national income or real output, instead of units just for that single product. But it's still kind of a fairly similar product curve. So the demand curve shows a relationship always between price and goods. Macroeconomics actually looks at working with the whole economy when they're determining it. So it includes all the goods and services demanded, where the microeconomic curve just has the price of one good on the y-axis. All right, so it's really not terribly complicated. You're going to realize that national output, and we talked about this back in chapter 13, is equal to the national income and national expenditure. So your entire national output is inclusive of national income and expenditure, money in and out. In macroeconomics analysis, so the x-axis, that's why we refer to it as the real output, the value of the national output when it's adjusted for inflation. Remember, anytime there's real, it means inflation has been adjusted. That way, if prices have gone up over time, it doesn't inflate our economy. And so that's indicated by Y. So aggregate demand curve shows a relationship between average price level and real output. There's two different diagrams there to help you kind of see the difference. All right, so don't confuse the two. The word aggregate pretty much just means total. So whenever you're making an aggregate demand curve, you're going to look at the demand from all the sectors of the economy. And that's what creates this aggregate demand. There's a few other players. So you've got your Y. We've kind of talked about Y already, isn't it? So Y is the output across the entire economy. Consumption, C, is another important acronym that we need to display. Consumption is the total spending by the consumers on domestic goods and services. So that's stuff within the country, not spending on stuff outside of the country like imports, right? When you look at the consumer demands for goods, you're looking at two categories, and this is something new, so you're going to have to get familiar with these terms: durable versus non-durable goods. Durable goods is exactly how it sounds. They're strong, right? They last for over a year. They're things like cars, mobile phones, bicycles. It's not something you just throw away within a year. A non-durable good are goods like rice, toilet paper, newspapers. They're pretty much things that are used over a short period of time. You use them up and get rid of them. So whenever we're talking consumption, we always look at durable and non-durable goods. But consumption is the total spending in the domestic market. Got it? Investment, I. So as an addition of capital stock in the economy, investment is carried out by firms. So there's a couple different types of investments that you make. As a firm, you might do a replacement investment. So that's pretty much whenever you spend money in order to maintain productivity on your existing capital. So you're replenishing your stocks, right? Replacing them. Induced investment is when a firm spends capital to increase their output and respond to higher demand in the economy. So it tends to be more like adding new things to it instead of replenishing, because there's now demand and you have to produce more. So the economy's capital stock includes all the goods that are made up by people and are used to produce these goods made up by people other goods and services. So factories, machines, offices, computers, those are all examples of investment because you use those to then make other goods and services. Investment is not to be confused with things like buying shares or putting money in the bank. So although in English language, that's usually what you associate investment in terms of macroeconomics, we're not looking at it in that sense. It's any kind of capital that is used to support it, things like machinery, offices. So that be careful you don't confuse the two. That's really important. Another factor in all this is the government spending. Remember, there's a lot of different parts of the economy. At several different levels, whether federal, which is the whole country, or state level, which is a little more local. There's spending taken on by the government in terms of goods and services. So examples, health, education, law and order, which is policing, right? Transportation, social security, which is benefits for the elderly. I know we don't have those in UAE. Housing, defense. So the amount of government spending, G, really just depends on the policies of the government and their objectives. Finally, we have our net exports, that's X minus M. Exports are domestic goods and services, so it's goods and services in the country that are bought by foreigners. All right, so if we're in the UAE, we might be exporting oil, which is one of our biggest exports, to other countries that need oil because we have oil here and they may not. When the firm in a country sells exports to foreigners, it results in an inflow of revenue into the country. So when you sell to outside countries, revenue then starts coming into the country. Imports, on the other hand, are goods and services that are bought from foreign producers. So they're bought from the outside. When the imports are brought, it's an outflow because you're spending money on stuff that you're getting from other countries because you don't have that resource locally, or it's cheaper, right? There's a few reasons why. So the net trade component of aggregated demand is actually export revenues minus import expenditure. Look at the terminology there. It's not selling and buying. It's revenues from exports versus expenditure on imports. And the simplified equation is X minus M. X obviously representing export revenues, subtracting then from it M, which are the import revenues. The figure can be positive when you have higher export revenues than spending on imports. It could be negative when it's the other way around. If the net figure is positive, it's going to add to aggregated demand. If it's negative, it's going to reduce aggregated demand. Got it? So that's how the net exports impacts your demand curve in a macroeconomic sense. So the entire aggregate demand can be represented in a formula. C plus I plus G plus X minus M. So here in 14.2, can you see that right there? That demonstrates the diagram here where you have the demand curve, right? The AD, aggregate demand, equaling C plus I plus G plus X minus M. All right. The shape of the demand average, so the shape of the curve is important because remember that lets us know pretty much what's going on in the economy. So when the prices change, we know the law of demand, the change directly impacts demand. So for example, if the price is going from PL1 to PL2, price is dropping, look what's happening to the output. It's increasing because we know that as prices decrease, demand automatically increases. So the level of output by consumers plus the investment that the firms put in, plus governments, plus the net foreign sector increases from Y1 to Y2. It's not just one of those necessarily, or all of them, but the overall value increases, which is why we move along the aggregate demand curve and then produce more units. You're going to find different books using different labels for the x-axis. So you may find any of the national income Y, it could be national expenditure, national output, real output, whichever one you choose, just make sure that it's different from Q, because when you just put Q, it makes it look like you're not differentiating between microeconomic curve and macroeconomic curve. Changes in aggregate demand. Just like in microeconomics, there could be shifts. A change in the price will result in movement along the curve, exactly the same as micro. A change in any of the components of aggregate demand will then cause a shift. So an increase in the components of aggregate demand will create an increase in aggregate demand, and that's going to shift it to the right. So an increase in any of those variables will cause a shift to the right. A decrease, on the other hand, will cause a shift to the left. Are we all together? So that's how you see changes in aggregate demand. So let's take a look more at what are some examples of component changes that will cause shifts. So it changes in income. The most significant determinant of consumption is income. All right, we will consume more as people in society if we have a higher income. As the economy grows, the national income rises, that could then create increased aggregate demand. Changes in interest rates also impact us. That's why you see the government's constantly raising, or right now, the interest rates are at an all-time low because of the COVID-19. Spending on non-durable goods is carried out on day-to-day money, so that's stuff that we're using every day. But some of the money that's used to buy durable goods come from money which people borrow from the bank. When you buy a car, you don't really buy it from cash in your pocket because it's such a huge investment. So, as a result of that, when people borrow money to buy those durable goods, depending on the interest rates you are being charged, it will either encourage them to borrow more or less money. So when you increase the interest rates, actually, what essentially is happening is you're increasing the price of borrowed money. So the consumption is going to fall. It's more expensive now to borrow that money, so you're not going to take that loan out to buy that durable good, that car. Borrowed money is usually used to buy things like houses. A lot of consumers get a loan for houses, and that's got a different name. A loan specific to house is called a mortgage. If the interest rates increase, then the loan becomes way more expensive on a month-to-month basis, so people are going to have way less money to then spend on other goods and services. So you can see how it's a knock-on effect when interest rates go up. It then also leads to consumption falling. A rise in interest rates makes savings a lot more attractive too, because interest doesn't just mean money, the cost of borrowing, but actually the cost of leaving savings in an account is going. So you're rewarded more for leaving your money in the bank, and you're penalized more for taking it out. So overall, people just stop borrowing money, stop consuming. So an overall increase in interest rates leads to a fall in consumption. On the other hand, a fall in interest rates will increase consumption, ceteris paribus. Because once again, as it becomes more attractive to borrow money, you are going to then take it out and maybe buy that second car or buy that bigger house because it's cheaper and cheaper to raise money. All right, so I hope that makes sense. Can you see how interest rates directly impacts consumption? Changes in wealth is another factor that we need to look at. The amount of consumption depends on the amount of wealth that people have. So this is a little bit different than income. All right, so the amount of consumption and the wealth of consumers is linked in several ways. It's really important not to confuse income and wealth, because I know in your mind sometimes in the English terminology they seem the same. Wealth is made up of the assets that people own. So this can include physical assets, houses, art, jewelry, antiques. There's a whole bunch of stuff that could, even like your bank savings and investments and shares, all of those things contribute to wealth. So there are two main factors that can change the level of wealth in the economy. Change in house prices. When house prices increase, your wealth increases. Why? Because now it's worth more value than it initially was worth. So it lets people feel confident, and then it indirectly increases their consumption. A change in the value of stocks and shares is another thing. So if consumers are holding tons of stocks and shares in a company, the value of those shares increase, making people feel more wealthy. So it's going to encourage them to spend a lot more. So it's a bit of a psychological effect in a way, isn't it? Alternatively, they might choose to sell those shares and then use those actual earnings to increase consumption. So either way, consumption goes up. So that is how changes in wealth can actually shift the aggregate demand curve. If people, so expectations and consumer confidence is another big thing. If people are optimistic about their economic future, then they're way more likely to spend. If they think the future is good, they're going to open up those pockets. If they think they're getting a promotion in the future, because the economy is booming or something like that, they're going to be way more likely to increase their savings. So higher consumer confidence will lead to increased consumption, causing a shift to the right in aggregate demand. However, if you expect crappy conditions and things to worsen, guess what? You're not going to be spending, you're going to be saving just in case. Your consumer confidence will go down and it'll shift to the left. There's a measure for this economists use called the Consumer Confidence Index or the Confidence Sentiment Index. And it pretty much just measures the level of confidence. If it's rising, then consumer spending is likely to rise as well. So it's just another indicator, right? Another factor that can play the part in shifting the aggregate demand curve is household indebtedness. So how much households are willing or able to borrow, once again getting back into that terminology, are willing and able to borrow money, affects the consumption. It's easy to borrow money. For example, you're given a lot of credit or easy credit, and the interest rates are low, then it's more likely that houses will take on more debt, getting loans, use those credit cards, and then spending rises. If the interest rates are really high and it's harder to get hold of credit and you don't have access to credit cards, then you're going to spend more to have to repay your mortgages and loans. So what's going to happen? Eventually, you'll spend less. In the short run, you might just continue to borrow and borrow and borrow until the debt reaches a point that you'll have less money spending on goods and services, and you're going to be spending all in interest rates. So it's this constant battle of indebtedness. To some extent, you will borrow, but then it gets to a point where you're going to stop borrowing because now the price of that borrowing money is actually more expensive than the value of it, and then you end up in this unbearable debt. So those are all different things that could impact consumption. All of that, those are ways of shifting just for the consumption, right? This is a really long chapter, I'm sorry. Let's look at now what can cause a shift in terms of the investment changing. So interest rates, more specifically. So it's kind of similar to the other one, your level of debtness that you can take on, because it's linked directly debt to interest rates. Firms need money. Money is used from those firms to invest in other resources like expanding, hiring staff, paying for marketing material, all of that cool stuff. They can use retained profits or they can borrow their own money. So both of these are affected by the interest rates. If the money borrowed has a higher cost, it's going to fall. It's going to lead to a fall in your investment. You're probably not going to be investing in as much stuff. If interest rates are high, then firms might prefer to put their retained profits in a bank. So you're not going to be, once again, spending and buying that machinery and investing more. A decrease in interest rates from 7% to 4% will decrease the incentive to save. So that decrease means a lower cost of borrowing, so it's more likely that you're going to borrow. So you're going to have an increased investment level from I1 to I2. So a result of lower interest means that, so it's just like a price going down almost. The percentage of interest going down leads to higher appetite for investing because it's just cheaper, less risky. It's common sense, isn't it? So interest rates directly impact changes in investment. Another thing that impacts changes in investment is changes in the level of national income. As national income rises, this leads to an increase in consumption, like we already discussed. If national income and consumption are rising, then there's going to be more pressure for output. So firms are going to have to invest. They're going to need more land, more materials, more sources to meet this demand. So national income impacts both consumption as well as investments. So we refer to this as induced investment. So we say an investment accelerates when national income rates rise. All right. So it's an increase in investment as a result of an increase in national income. Changes in technology can also impact the investment curve. In any dynamic economy, there's going to be a lot of technological change. We see it all the time. Every minute you blink your eyes and better technology out there. That's going to lead to higher advances, because to remain competitive, you will have to invest. If all the other companies have the new technology, you don't, you'll either shut down or eventually invest. Thus, increase in investment. Expectations, business confidence is another thing, a little bit linked to consumer sentiment. Businesses make decisions about the investment they should make based to a large extent on their own expectation, on what they think the economic climate is. So there's not going to be a lot of point in investing to increase output if you feel like demand is about to fall. If businesses are quite confident, they're going to vamp up their spending and investment, right? So it's similar to the consumer confidence, but it's more on the business side. Economists regularly measure the confidence of businesses and publish the data in the form of something called a business confidence index. As you can see, there's a lot of repetition in these. All right, so we've talked about consumption, things that can shift that. We've talked about investment. Let's talk now about government spending. Government spending can be impacted because, look, the amount and nature of government spending really depends on a range of factors and goals. Whenever you talk about subsidies, if the government has made a commitment to financially support a certain industry, like healthcare, if there's been a big issue with healthcare right now for coronavirus, then the government spending is obviously going to rise. Governments are obliged to spend to correct the market failure because they made that promise. So if they promise to open up more clinics and 24-hour hospitals to battle COVID-19 and all that, they have to do that. A new education and health policy might require increased public spending in schools. We look at government policies then to affect the AD shortly. So whenever they start increasing spending, it will impact the aggregate demand. So once again, external factors, promises made by the government, objectives, those are the kind of things that can shift the aggregate demand in terms of government spending. 22 minutes, let's keep going. What causes changes in government spending? We've done that. Now let's get on to imports and exports. Exports, once again, these are things that foreigners are buying from your country. So they're made domestically, sold abroad. If foreign income rises, right, so the other countries are getting wealthier, then guess what? They can afford a lot more items from abroad, fancy cool stuff, or petrol from the UAE in our case. So the Chinese national income, when it rises, Chinese people are more willing and able to buy imported goods and services from, for example, Europe. So the European exports rise as the Chinese economy starts to grow. Similarly, China grows, investment in China expands, right? Because when they grow, they're going to need more output locally. So it's going to involve some level of imported capital because you might need, for example, some of the German technology to sustain some of your projects in China. Other changes in national income of trading partners, for example, the value of a currency in a different country can impact you, whether on an export level. If a country's exchange rate becomes stronger, then it makes exports kind of expensive to foreigners. So let's say we're in the UAE. If our dirham gets really strong, well, the UK, they're buying in pounds. So if our dirham keeps rising and rising, they're now getting less for those pounds than they originally getting. So it can actually hurt the export. So the law of demand tells you that once again, as the price goes up, as it gets more expensive, guess what happens to demand? It's going to fall. So the same impact's going to happen on the revenues from the exports, right? The X in the equation, X minus M. It's going to fall, making the overall net value less because people aren't going to buy as much if it becomes more expensive. Conversely, if our exchange rate, if the dirham gets really weak, our products are going to look pretty darn sexy to those international companies and way more likely to buy them. Changes in the country's policy can also affect it, the exports. If a country decides to adopt a policy that's a little more like free trade, so less tariffs, less charges on imports, so allow more movement between countries, obviously it can allow exports to increase. On the other hand, if a country wants to have protectionist policies, so Donald Trump has been doing this a lot, he wants to keep his stuff in America for Americans. So it makes more jobs for America, and we're not buying cheaper stuff from outside and selling and this and that. So when they want to reduce the level of imports, then that can change the whole equation too. So that can indirectly hurt your exports. The last broad factor that can change your export revenues is pretty much the inflation rates among trading partners, because once again, exports rely, it's not just on the selling country, but on the receiving country. So any financial changes among either of those parties could increase or decrease exports. Inflation in the US means that relatively higher than Canada. So now all of a sudden, Canadian goods might not, Canada might not look as US as being very competitive, because with inflation, the prices are going up. So the US earns from its exports to Canada. Those earnings might go down. On the other hand, if inflation rates in the US are relatively lower than Canada, our products are starting to look pretty good, which means export revenues might increase. Ceteris paribus, obviously, CP, right? Ceteris, or however the heck you pronounce it. Imports, because remember, there's two parts of this equation. There's imports and exports. So imports, M. Okay, so we've already established the fact that a country's national income is going to create an increased consumption. As people consume more goods, necessarily the goods and services might end up having to be imported. Sometimes when we consume from abroad. When we're wealthier, we start looking around. We want the fancy stuff from the European countries and all that stuff. Similarly, as national income rises, there's probably going to be more investment, because once again, there needs to be more output, so companies are going to invest. So goods that will be purchased from imported capital goods and or components, like supplies from abroad, raw materials from other countries, that could create an increase in imports. The national income rises, so does spending on imports. If the national income falls, then there'll be reduced spending on imports. Got it? So national income is actually impacting almost all of the different variables. Using the same analysis, you can actually see how changes in the exchange rate would also affect the import level. If you have an increase in the exchange rate, imported goods would become less expensive. So guess what's going to happen? More demand for imports. So if our currency is stronger, it's cheaper for us to buy stuff from other countries. So we're more likely to then purchase imports. It's completely the opposite. If we have a weaker currency, then it's going to take way more dirhams to buy from abroad, so we're less likely to import things. That's going to lower the amount of imports. So currency exchange rates can actually have a significant impact on imports. The type of trade policies a country adopts, once again, just like exports, can impact it. If it's more of a free market, once again, and taxes are reduced on imports, tariffs, the tariffs on imports would go down, then we're going to import more stuff, right? If the taxes go up, we're going to import less because it's more expensive. Inflation also. Once again, you need to look at your trade partners when you have a higher inflation. Obviously, depending on the currency, the value of your prices compared to other countries, it could make you look more or less competitive. So the net exports, the difference between exports revenue and import expenditure, really depends on national domestic income, foreign national income, so the income of the other people, changes in exchange rates, changes in trade policies, and relative inflation rates. Those are the main big things that we're going to be discussing in the next chapter, for the rest of this chapter. Well, let me just check and see. Only a couple pages left, guys. Sorry. Government policies affecting aggregate demand. All right, this is getting into the fun macroeconomic stuff. Governments have two broad policies that affect the aggregate demand of the economy. They're called fiscal and monetary policy. So these are two strategies you can do to heat up or slow down demand in your economy. Fiscal policy is when the government sets policies relating to either spending or taxation. You got things called direct taxes, all right? Direct taxes on income and indirect taxes, which is on goods and services like VAT. Those can be raised or lowered to manipulate how much disposable income consumers have. Governments use they call it expansionary fiscal policy to increase aggregate demand, and contractionary or deflationary fiscal policy to reduce. So let's describe it. So expansionary fiscal policy is exactly how it sounds. They're trying to grow. So if the government wants to encourage more consumption, then they lower the income taxes and increase disposable income. If you're being taxed less, you have more profits as a company, more income, in this case, as a consumer. So more spending will occur. Aggregate demand increases. If the government want to encourage more investment, they can lower the corporate taxes side. So if they want to, consumption is on the income, because that's your consumers get charged income tax. They would lower corporate tax because the investment is on the company side. More profits they have, the more likely they can then spend because they're not being taxed less. That increases aggregate demand. Governments have major investment projects themselves and might increase spending for that. So increasing public services, that impacts aggregate demand. So if they start building more things, then there's more construction companies hiring people and spending money, and you can see how demand will then increase with increased government. So fiscal policy is just two main things: messing around with taxes, either raising or increasing them or decreasing them, and then at the same time spending. Taxes, government spending, fiscal policy. Monetary policy is when you start looking at interest rates. The level of money supply in the economy is a pretty high topic, and we don't get into that in IB. It's just way above your grade here, okay? However, you got to be aware how interest rates can affect aggregate demand in the economy. In any economy, there's an array of different interest rates. Advertisements offering low mortgage rates or competitive financing, all these things, you hear about this all the time. Although banks are regulated by the government, they're usually quite free to set rates themselves. So we talk about interest rates, it's a tool of monetary policy. When we talk about it, though, we're talking about as a base rate, discount or prime rate that's set by the government central bank. So the central bank is not a private profit-making bank, but it's pretty much the government's bank, and it ultimately has the authority and control over the money supply in the economy. They want to make sure that the money supply is being kept in line with the government's objectives. So some countries, the government controls with a central bank. So we follow in the UAE, America's central bank, because we're locked to the dollar. In some countries, the government controls the central bank, but in most industrialized countries these days, the central bank is independent, and the primary responsibility of maintaining, so they are an independent board away from the government, but they have to make sure that inflation doesn't get out of control and that the economy is stable. So the changes in the central bank rates ultimately impact all the borrowing and lending in the economy. They're an important signal of the country's monetary policy. So even the central bank might be independent. We usually consider their activities really to be part of government monetary policy. Changes in the central bank's interest rate affects aggregate demand. How? Increased aggregate demand in the central bank might lower the base rate. This ultimately reduces the cost of borrowing, and it leads actually to more consumption and investment. So we call this expansionary or loose monetary policy. When you lower interest rates, it creates more spending from consumers and more investment from companies. So demand is increased. So that's called loose monetary policy, where you're trying to expand and make it easier and more flexible to borrow. Contractionary or tight monetary policy looks to decrease demand because maybe inflation is starting to occur and you want to cool off the thing a bit. So in that case, you'd increase the base rate, make interest rates higher. Does that make sense? So that is all of, that's a 35-minute thing. And we just barely kind of touched up on fiscal and monetary policy, but just remember aggregated demand, how you calculate it. It's all those different subsets of things like consumption, investment, government spending, imports and exports. And then know how to create a shift in the aggregate demand by all those different variables we talked about. This was really long. My apologies, Sab's out.